The Word made manifest through sacred geometry. David Hamel's zero-point U.F.O technology and its connection to the Bible, the Great Pyramid, and other ancient artifacts. Written by Robert Thomas. I won't be reading the entirety of this book due to many chapters containing a lot of diagrams and mathematics, so I highly recommend anyone who's interested to find a copy for themselves. So I'm just reading David's story for the most part here. Chapter 1. I'm building a ship like Noah with technology from the ancients. David's story by Jeane Manning. British Columbia, February 2nd, 1999. David Hamel's gravelly voice booms across the telephone lines from Ontario. They told me Stonehenge was a base to build a ship on. Yes, to build a U.F.O. I reach for my note-taking tablet. The familiar French-Canadian accent on the phone continues, describing more memories. It's been 4 years since our mutual friend, Pierre Sinclair, co-authored and published The Granite Man and the Butterfly, the story of David's inspiring encounter. In the meantime, home building, business, and family responsibilities forced Pierre to shelve the now rusting prototype of an energy generator that he was building according to the older man's instructions. Out east in rural Ontario, David is still struggling to recreate a spacecraft. Occasionally he remembers more details of the knowledge that otherworldly beings impressed on him more than 20 years ago. Details such as, pay attention to ancient artifacts. Now a general contractor from Washington State, Robert Thomas has stepped in to help. Robert has a Bachelor of Science degree in Civil Engineering from the University of Washington. He will be writing a book from a different perspective, and Pierre is generously sharing photos and information. Now over the telephone, David is explaining more about the artwork I'd seen on the walls of his house, replicas of Egyptian paintings. His comments conclude with, "That's all, my dear." Unceremoniously, David hangs up the phone. My file of notes has grown thicker, and it's time to hand it over to someone else. Robert Thomas has asked me to sum up David's incredible story in a chapter or two for this new book so that he can present his own findings, which indicate that ancient knowledge is indeed resurfacing through today's contactees, such as David Hamel. Why have the findings of a man who describes himself as a simple carpenter become a topic of study for engineers? How did a 74-year-old man living in the rocky bushland of rural Ontario become a well-known name on the new energy websites? Why me? Is David's own humble question when he thinks about the events of one night in October 1975. Perhaps he was chosen for a mission because those who chose him had already observed his qualities of heart and spirit. On May 14th, 1924, in Rosemont, Quebec, David Pierre Hamel was born into a large family who struggled to survive in a depressed economy. He had to leave his schooling in the 9th grade to look for work. At the time, perhaps due to the shortage of food at the family dinner table, he was only 5 feet tall. However, physical labor on farms and jumping freight trains to find employment elsewhere built up his strength and stamina as well as resourcefulness. His resulting powerful physique helped save his life on more than one occasion during the following years. The horrendous years of World War II tested both the inner and outer strength of a generation of young men. Although David was underage when Canada entered the war, he attempted repeatedly to join the Army and was finally successful. He was shipped overseas with the Army Services Corps and was then transferred to guard duty with the Lorne Scots Army Service Corps of the Canadian Army. At that time, he did not speak English well enough for the job, so he was transferred back to a French-Canadian outfit, Les Fusiliers, Mont Royal, FMR, 2nd Division, who were headed toward the Dieppe raid. His regiment was near the front of Allied troops advancing through France on June 6, 1944, when they were pinned down by gunfire from German tanks at Falaise. Private David P. Hamel knew that the regiment had advanced too quickly and too far into the fire, but there was no way to stop the bloody events that unfolded. After 3 days and nights in the howling din of the battlefield, David's heart was wrenched by grief when his best buddy was shot and fell dying in the mud in front of him. The disastrous experience on the blood-soaked and muddy battlefield continued until July 19, 1944. German soldiers surrounded what remained of the Canadian regiment. David's first close-up sight of a German soldier affected him deeply. My God, he looked so much like us. How could we kill each other? But each was trained to kill the other. David held an automatic machine gun and was not prepared to surrender. He tried to do as he was trained, but his gun, slick with mud, kept slipping in his hands and the firing mechanism wouldn't work. Facing the enemy eye to eye at a distance of about 15 feet, David believed the other soldier would see that he was unable to shoot. The other man showed no mercy. Although he was equally terror-stricken, the enemy soldier took aim and fired at David once, then again. One bullet had pierced his breast near a lung, and the other bullet had left metal fragments lodged between 2 vertebrae. Pain overwhelmed David. When he gained consciousness, his buddies were carrying him along upright. Their corporal had been taken away, and the remaining French-Canadian were forced to march behind German tanks while guns were pointed at them. The prisoners and their guards stopped at a German-commandeered hospital in Paris just long enough for French doctors to dress their wounds. Doctors operated on David and removed 1 bullet, but did not have the proper equipment to remove the fragments lodged in the spine. David and the 47 other wounded prisoners were herded into a railroad station and loaded into a boxcar intended to hold 8 horses. The train was carrying Jewish prisoners to Poland. At camps along the way, the Canadians were interrogated and threatened. David and the others spent a nightmare of 10 days with only 2 portions of potato soup and water. At Stalag 12D, Jewish prisoners were separated out. David's identity was reduced to a number, -70347. He tried to escape and was recaptured and shipped to a prisoner of war camp, albeit Commando 1007, near the border between Poland and Germany. David was sickened by more than his weakened physical condition by witnessing degraded behavior, such as soldiers knocking the teeth out of dead prisoners to get the gold. Nationalities fought among themselves, killing over jealousies, language misunderstandings, or rumors of informers. During his 5 months as a prisoner, David concluded that all this hatred is caused by lack of knowledge of who we are, what we're in this world for. He had his own prejudices, however. The camp held many prisoners, most of them British, who had been captured in North Africa. They had been in the camp for more than 2 years and had survived in a manner that David and his fellow French Canadians viewed as fraternizing with the enemy. David held on to his training that had drilled into him the message to escape in a soldier's duty, when he surreptitiously asked fellow prisoners for extra bread to take with them. The British refused. One reason? Their captors had threatened to kill 12 prisoners for every one who escaped. David learned to keep his thoughts to himself, but when the barefoot prisoners were put to work at tasks such as picking sugar beets in the fields and processing them in a sugar factory, he spoke out. "You want to help the enemy? Go ahead," he told his fellow prisoners. "Me, I'm not going to. When he refused the guard's orders, a guard stabbed David through the calf of his leg with a bayonet. Heavy beatings and other abuse were followed, with David being pushed at bayonet point into the factory. Although forced into a semblance of a work routine, he kept his eyes open for a chance to sabotage. One day he noticed some rusty nuts and bolts and a piece of wire on the ground. He scooped them into his hand when no one was looking. Later that day he was standing near the dynamo that powered the factory. When the guard's attentions were diverted, he tossed the scrap metal into the dynamo with one quick motion. He then walked away from the area and stood innocently at a distance before the dynamo blew up. Still determined to escape, he hoarded the butter from his Red Cross pack instead of trading for cookies, cigarettes, or tea. Every day when the prisoners returned from forced labor, he furtively glanced around and planned his escape route. As the war intensified, the prisoners were sent out into the nearby city of Dresden to pick up dead bodies from the streets and throw them into a horse-drawn cart. Upon re-entering the camp, the other prisoners generally walked with heads down in a posture of defeat and exhaustion. David, however, covertly scanned details of the brick prison. Since it was a work camp, it was not surrounded by the layers of fencing and the guard dogs that surrounded other prisoner-of-war camps. One day he noticed, with grim satisfaction, a careless construction detail. One window was held on the outside by only 3 strands of barbed wire secured to the window frame itself. From then on, whenever he had a moment in the darkness of the nights when his guards were not attentive, David used his fingernails and later a metal nail to scrape at the cement around the window and expose the nails holding it. He chose moments when the din of the bombing over the city was loud enough to cover the sounds of scraping. He secretly rubbed away the concrete to loosen the nails so that he could pull them out with string made from scraps of cloth. One night, while his exhausted comrades slept, David wrapped his feet in strips of cloth taken from a corpse. He finished cutting the nails between the window frame and the building. The noise of a bombing raid covered the rasping as he pushed out the window. He squeezed through the opening and fell to the ground. He quickly lifted the window frame back into place with the barbed wire still on it. He had escaped, but he had escaped into the fire, literally, the beginning of the hellish firebombing of Dresden. He ran further into the countryside. When airplanes flew overhead, he crawled on his stomach through tall grass. Eventually he found a barn with a horse in it. Having no shirt, not even an undershirt, David needed the horse blanket more than the horse did. He was able to calm the animal and take the blanket as well as some leather straps and some lengths of wire that were coiled on the barn floor. These items would later become essential to his escape from Germany. In the dim light of this first night of perilous freedom, he also found a vegetable garden and well water. David knew he must find a way to get out of this dangerous region. He ran from hiding place to hiding place on the outer ridge of the flaming city during the nights while searchlights lit the skies, then hid during daylight. The pom of heavy artillery filled his ears continually. He knew he must somehow connect with Allied troops. The streets of chaotic Dresden were empty. The residents were hiding in basements and other shelters. Once he watched the sky from a hiding place as Allied aircraft flew overhead and dropped wave after wave of bombs on Dresden. He could see individual battles between Allied and Nazi pilots. During this drama, something drew his eye skyward beyond the bombers. High above the fighting, 5 lights strung out in a V formation and stayed in that position for a remarkable length of time. The formation suddenly shifted into a diamond shape, and the lights continued to hover throughout the bombing. What could those high-altitude lights be? The puzzled escapee wondered, do the generals have some kind of advanced technology aircraft to observe in this crucial battle? The strange behavior of the high-altitude craft quickly left his mind as he continued the dangerous search for a way out of the area. After circling most of the city, his feet struck a railroad bed and he felt the wooden ties below him in the darkness. He dared to hope and followed the tracks to a tunnel that went into an earth-sheltered freight yard. He hid near a coal pile near the entrance and, shivering under the horse blanket, studied the layout. A train of flat cars loaded with German armored vehicle tanks appeared to be heading toward Poland. With dawn's early light, he knew that the tracks heading to the horizon would take the train toward the Eastern Front. Before the light of day brought activity to the freight yard, David had crawled under a flatbed car, unaware that the tanks on the rail cars held soldiers. He wired his blanket under the floor, forming a hammock, his hideout for about 2 weeks after the train left Dresden. As he lay shivering on his swaying hammock, his face only inches from the underside of the flatbed, David's injuries throbbed fiercely. The pain in his back helped take his attention away from the hunger contractions in his belly. Despite the pain, the deafening noise of the train wheels, and the danger of being found whenever the train halted, he was relieved to be leaving Dresden. The flat car he hid under was carrying Tiger tanks and a pile of logs bound with heavy cables. He could hear the shouts of the soldiers as they camouflaged the train whenever it stopped. Whenever the tanks were driven off a quickly constructed log ramp, David's hammock would tip. He prayed no one would look closely under the flat car. Early in the trip, he heard what seemed to be the unloading of prisoners at a stop where the fumes of death were in the air. When the train stopped at Krakow, 10 days into the trip, a Red Cross train filled with wounded prisoners of war passed on another track. Some of the prisoners hung their heads out of the open windows and yelled at the soldier heading east and shook their fists. The weather grew increasingly cold, and David knew he must keep up his strength. He grew bolder in searching nearby farms for food and water during the blackest nights when the train was halted. At one stop he found rags of clothing to keep him from freezing to death. Before dark one evening, he heard the thumping of soldiers jumping out of tanks and seating themselves on the edge of the flat car. He could see their boots hanging over the side as they ate dinner. From their conversation, which he could only vaguely interpret, David figured that the train was heading toward the Russian front. Crumbs fell past his hiding place as the soldiers ate, apparently engrossed in their conversation. David couldn't resist the temptation to whip his hand out and catch a few morsels. Another time, he stealthily left his hammock and boldly grabbed a ration tin off the flat car when the soldiers were away. His closest brush with being discovered was when a French poodle, apparently belonging to the officer in charge of the station where the train had stopped, found him in the hammock and clamped his teeth into David's knee. Forced to squeeze the dog's nose and stick it with a wire until the dog opened its mouth and fled, David lay shaken and perspiring afterward. The dog's squeak of terror apparently went unheard by the Germans. It was a close call. After a few days of hearing the firing of guns, actually the Russian army, approaching closer and closer, David had the feeling that the war in this part of the world was reaching a turning point. The train stopped. He heard the confused, frightened soldiers running about, camouflaging the train so it couldn't be seen by bombers overhead. It was now dangerous for David for forage at night, since the local Yugoslavian guerrillas were sniping at the train. David realized that the Allied pilots wouldn't be able to see a strategic resource visible from this vantage point. The Germans had built huge storage tanks into a hillside nearby. The fuel tanks were about 40 feet high and 80 feet in diameter. To any airplanes flying over, the tank's camouflage would appear to be an extension of the mountain. The train remained halted in the area for a few days. David understood that the local guerrillas had been unable to get close enough to the fuel supply to blow it up. Hidden oil tanks were an even more strategic target than the railroad itself. With the rail cars, with their cargo hunkered under camouflage, David slipped into the nearby town, whose name he understood to be Levitsia. A loosely organized band of underground fighters, who spoke a number of dialects, were made to realize that David was a Canadian, not their enemy. The resistance group exchanged gunfire with the German soldiers in ongoing battles. David discovered a metal cover in a village street, opened it, and climbed down a ladder into a tunnel. He saw the large sewer pipe under the street as a safer hiding place. Replacing the cover left him in total darkness. As he reached forward with his hands to feel his way, he stumbled into some who reacted as if fighting for his life. As the two grappled in the darkness, David accidentally shoved his fingers into the other's mouth. The opponent bit his finger to the bone and broke it at the joint nearest the nail, broke a second finger on David's hand, and refused to open his jaws and release the fingers. David smashed the stranger's head against the wall to get him to open his mouth, and hastily backed out of the tunnel. When he returned, the man was gone. Although yet another part of his body now throbbed with pain, David was obsessed with figuring out how the Allied pilots could learn about the strategic target. The guerrillas seemed to lack the long-range firepower needed to blow up the huge tanks that held the German oil supply. In the darkness one evening, when he heard the Allied bombers coming, David peeked out of a hiding place near where the German soldiers were waiting inside their tanks on the rail cars. He slipped back under the flatbed to get his stolen matches and the candle he made out of the tin of butter, axle grease, and a wick of fabric. Ignoring the danger from ground fire and from the rifles of the Yugoslavian guerrillas who perhaps didn't know who he was, David boldly ran into the open and signaled as the bombers approached. To attract attention with his flaming butter flare, he used the Morse code SOS signal by putting his hand over the candle and then withdrawing it for 3 series of 3 long and short signals. He burned his hand, but continued to signal anyway. Someone on the Allied aircraft apparently saw his flashing message. Flare were dropped from the sky and lit up the area, illuminating the railroad cars loaded with tanks, and more importantly, the oil supply on the mountainside. David ran for cover, mission accomplished. Unknown to him, a Yugoslavian physician from Budapest, Zumbar Ziancovic, who was in the area to help the guerrilla fighters, witnessed David's courageous deed. Before the bombing began, David reached the train and dove into a log pile for cover. The airborne Allies released bombs toward both targets, railroad cars and storage tanks. The tanks exploded, and the force of the blast shifted the logs where David tried to make a shelter for himself. Rolling logs struck his shoulder and injured his collarbone and a leg. As soon as the bombing ceased, the Yugoslavian doctor quickly pulled David from the log pile and helped him limp along as they hurried toward the road, away from the flaming train. The side of the mountain was on fire. The railway tracks up there were twisted, the flatbeds were contorted, and the tanks were blown up. Any remaining German soldiers were lined up outside the smoking ruins. When the 2 men were at a safe distance from the scene of destruction, they slapped each other on the back, jubilant that their enemy's train and fuel supply had been blown up. The doctor spoke some English. He introduced himself as a major in the Yugoslavian army, as well as a physician. David noted that the doctor was a large man in his 50s, with a ruddy face and red hair, who seemed to be a joyful individual. At his comrades' camp, the doctor bandaged David's bitten and burned hands. He gave David 2 pills to help him sleep and returned with food the next day. The guerrillas remained in hiding because the situation in the area was still chaotic. German soldiers from the train hid in the bushes. David knew he would be going home. He did not realize, however, how long it would take and how much more he would suffer. At the moment, he just savored the turn of events. Just how far east had he come since he first boarded the train? One of the guerrilla fighters, who seemed to comprehend the question from gestures, described this area in the mountains as 150 kilometers from Odessa. His arm movements indicated that they were east of Yugoslavia and north of the town of Odessa, near the Black Sea. The next afternoon, the Russian army marched around a curve in the road in uniforms that looked new, as if they'd just joined the war. Now the Slavic fighters could flush the Germans out of the woods, surround them, and turn them over to the army that was claiming a victory for Russia. The Russians, the civilian fighters, and the French-Canadian soldier all realized the significance of the destruction of the enemy's strategic resource and the liberation of the area. Their ensuing celebration transcended language barriers. The World War, in this region, was over. About a week later, a multilingual Russian officer drove David to the large airport at Vinnytsia, questioning him as they drove along. At one stop, an old airport at Lvov in Ukraine, a large crowd of Russian soldiers were celebrating, dancing around in the cold air. They gave David a loaf of bread and a swig of vodka. Dr. Zavinovich was there. He ceremoniously introduced David to the Russian soldiers as the hero he told them about, the Canadian who had risked his life to attract the Allied bombers. The soldiers' faces registered respect as they surrounded David. He savored the recognition ceremony, despite his pain and physical weakness resulting from his ordeals. Ignoring the fact that he wore ragged clothing and was cloaked in a blanket with a hole cut for his head instead of a dress uniform, he stood proudly before these soldiers who had fought the war as allies. Although far away from his own ground troops, he knew he had helped them by signaling their bombers. In honor of David's heroism, the Russian colonel pinned a medal on David's blanket. The colonel was a man in his early 60s with a serious expression and a firm handshake that shone pain throughout David's sore hand. The injured French-Canadian soldier nevertheless felt pleased and humble as he received the medal. The colonel of the 4th Russian Army, who knew Parisian French, wrote a note about the medal and the order it represented inside a Russian language book for David. Later in the jeep, riding toward the airport again, David studied his ivory and gold war medal with its diamond-studded star. Many years later, in 1996, he would recall that he had been inducted into the Order of the White Eagle, according to Robert Wurlich, author of Russian Orders, Decorations, and Medals. The order was founded by a king of Poland in 1325 AD and later conferred on Peter the Great. After 1831, the Russian Emperor Nicholas I incorporated the award into Russian orders and awarded it for outstanding civil or military merit. In 1921, the Polish Republic reinstated the Order of the White Eagle as their highest order. At the airport 4 days later, David believed he would be boarding an airplane that would transport him back to his people. Before stepping into the chaos of thousands of people from various nationalities who filled the airport, he realized it would be wise to wear the heavy metal with its precious gems more discreetly, so he pinned it inside his blanket. Officials had to fight the multitudes to clear people off the main airfield so an airplane could land and pick up released prisoners of war and others. Passengers on the American Embassy airplane that took David included 3 Americans who wore gas masks hanging to the side near their faces. Sitting with them on the floor of the embassy's crowded airplane on the trip to Belgium were a dozen men who presented themselves as Belgian soldiers, but David noticed that their uniforms showed no sign of wear. He believed they were German soldiers. "They're getting out of here," he mused. "You don't know whether they're an SS or ex-Gestapo or what. They bought their way in gold," he thought. 2 of them dropped diamonds on the floor, and a fight ensued. Representatives of the Turkish, Polish, and Yugoslav troops were among the mixture of nationalities on the airplane, and some died by gunshot in the melee. Confusion reigned while the men David believed to be Americans threw gas-releasing bombs inside the airplane. Many occupants of the aircraft were doped up by gas and put to sleep before the shootings, David recalled later. In what was described as a delousing compound and hospital in Brussels, he was stripped and the metal was taken from him. He vaguely recalls seeing men being taken away in wheelchairs by personnel wearing masks and not returning. David was given an injection and has no memory for the time period between February and late April 1944. He believes some medical procedure erased that memory. A few memories began to surface in the late 1990s and indicated that he had been detained in Brussels because someone suspected that he may have been carrying more jewels than the ones on his medal. They made me eat all kinds of stuff that made me go to the bathroom all the time, even though I was wounded with my fingers hurt right to the bone, he told an associate in 1999. In 1945, I was wearing a Belgian uniform. I am a Canadian. He has many questions. What was done to me during the months in Brussels? How did I get to England? What happened to the medal given to me? Why was I discharged with no wounds mentioned on my papers, yet I have records of several wounds? In David's first vague memory of his arrival in England, a high-ranking officer was leaning over his bed telling him that he was invited to a garden tea party to shake hands with the reigning monarch, King George VI, and his wife on June 19th. After realizing that he no longer had his medal, David felt offended by the invitation. 700 other former prisoners of war would receive that honor, and the royal handshake was no substitute. He'd been decorated with the Medal of Valor, and it had been stolen from him. With hundreds of other servicemen, David eventually returned from England on the boat Bon Pasteur, later on a train in Canada. His suspicions about Nazi officials buying their way into the country with ill-gotten gold remained with him. Without sharing his thoughts with any other returning Canadian soldiers, he strolled through the train, slipping through doors that were briefly left open. In a private coach, he stopped at the sight of a Teutonic man, patrician in demeanor, looking through a magnifying eyeglass at something in a cloth on his lap. Surprised to see David, the man tried to hide what he was doing. A few sparkling jewels dropped onto the carpet. David walked over to him and saw that the well-dressed man had been examining diamonds in a handkerchief. The French-Canadian scooped the jewels off the floor, handed them to the man, and spoke to him in English. The manacled stranger replied in German and pushed a button which summoned a police officer. David was forcibly ejected from the car. At the rear of the train, he realized that returning Canadian soldiers were traveling third class. There would be a hellish battle on the train if David told the other soldiers what he'd seen, so he decided to keep quiet. But word of his single-handed investigation may have reached authorities. 60 miles before they reached Montreal, part of the train was shunted onto another track. Royal Canadian Mounted Police surrounded the train and ordered all the servicemen to hand over their military souvenirs, claiming that someone had been shot on the train. David did not believe the excuse, but he refrained from starting a soldiers' rebellion because Royal Canadian Mounted Police and other Canadians might be killed in an ensuing riot. Back in civilian life, it was difficult for him to let go of bitterness. His own father, a member of the Home Veterans Guard, was on guard duty at the Long Point Ordnance Corps, where, in a hangar, David saw military personnel holding boxes filled with gold watches and other jewelry. He even glimpsed what looked like gold dental fillings. He believed that wealthy Nazis had bought their way into this country, but he did not blame the German people. Civilians of any war are the casualties, he told his family. They usually pay the heaviest price for wars. Although unable to work for a long time because of his wounds, including the metal lodged in his spine, He tried in vain to get the Federal Department of Veterans Affairs to give him a disability pension. From the time he was wounded to the time he returned from the war, he felt the bullet in his spine and was frustrated that nobody would take care of it. Finally, in the mid-50s, when one of his legs collapsed, a doctor removed the metal. They kept it. That's when they started to give me a little pension, in 1954, David recalls. Today the 70-year-old man is still incensed about the hypocrisy of my government when I got out of the army. He gave his papers to a helpful doctor in Paris in an attempt to track down a record of the events that began in the delousing compound, and to find the pictures of me in Buckingham Palace with King George VI and the Queen. All the years it took me to remember this, I'm a member of the Order of the White Eagle, David shouts. But because I'm a French Canadian, I'm not allowed to have my medal. Who the hell did that? British or American Intelligence Service? KGB? David tried to write to the Yugoslavian major beginning in 1945. A Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer returned the letter in person and informed David that he was not allowed to write to the enemy. The Cold War with the Soviets had begun. His only other contact with Royal Canadian Mounted Police in those years was in 1947, to report a sighting of a cigar-shaped blue object that flashed northward across the sky and sliced off tops of trees as it burned a swath through the bushland. David had been driving home to Montreal from Saskatchewan, where he had been working, and was on Highway 11 near Hearst, Ontario, when he saw it. Trees silhouetted against the sky were left damaged, so he reported in detail at the police station in the next village. The next time he was in the village and asked if the sighting was investigated, however, one officer told him that the station forgot to look into it. David himself forgot about the incident until nearly 30 years later, when an event changed his life profoundly. Maple Ridge, British Columbia, October 21st, 1975. Until this night, David Hamel had lived a relatively simple life after the breakup of his first marriage, and a subsequent marriage to Nora Mackenzie, a charming young woman who was physically handicapped with cerebral palsy. He had built a house for Nora on property in the wooded suburb of Maple Ridge, near Vancouver, British Columbia, bought from an insurance settlement after an automobile crashed into a trailer he had made for his first family. The story of the two marriages and events in between I told in The Granite Man and the Butterfly. David worked hard at construction and other jobs throughout those years. On this night, he followed the usual routine of carrying his wife to her couch in the television room and settling himself in his red, upholstered chair after turning on the television. Nora's friend Carol was also seated comfortably in the room as they prepared to watch a family show, The Waltons. David was happy to be resting after another day of physical labor. He saw the television screen go snowy, with silvery gray particles dancing behind the glass. Before he could react, two dots in the center of the screen morphed into two human shapes that emerged as if constructed from the silvery particles. Speechless, David had the impression that the shapes were two persons who now stood on either side of him. Each placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, and he looked up at one face and then the other. They looked like normal humans, except for their clothing, zipperless, one-piece silvery suits. He heard a voice in his mind, "We don't want to shock you, we just want to show you something." Suddenly he found himself floating toward the ceiling, while his physical body sat in the chair as if sleeping. Below him, Nora and Carol watched the Waltons as if nothing had been out of the ordinary for them. I must be in an astral body, David thought. They're elevating me in my spirit body. Again a message from one of the beings entered his mind. Don't be afraid, you're going to be all right. With his long-time habit of observing his surroundings, he looked around in the split second it took to pass from ceiling through the roof. Yes, his glass wall insulation was in satisfactory condition. It hadn't settled too much. Then he was outside the house. The two beings were inviting him to enter what looked like a large spaceship, stepping up 9 open stairs towards its doorway. He had the reassuring feeling of placing his weight on them with each step. The feeling was comfortably identical to the feeling of being in the physical body which he had left behind in his living room moments ago. Another man, whom David came to regard as the ship's mechanic, joined the other two hosts. David took a closer look at the men, one of them with a neatly trimmed beard, and the woman with shoulder-length hair. All were of average height and appearance, with skin toned about the same color as David's. They introduced themselves without moving their lips, through mental impressions. At one point they conveyed the thought that they had been observing his life. The woman was A, the mechanic was On, and Archon was A's husband. Their home planet was named Cladden, and David understood them to say that it was on the other side of the sun and in some manner of balance with the earth. David accepted the information as matter-of-factly as it was presented, but felt a surge of excitement as he looked around at details of the surroundings, such as items on the shelf, 3 transparent helmets about the size of motorcycle headgear. David was asked if he wanted to observe his body's workings. "It's up to you," he was told. "We don't force you. You can see if you want to." Curious to see their medical technology, he followed them into a room that held laboratory equipment for a do-it-yourself medical exam. As he moved a scanning diaphragm over his body, he saw its inner functions in color on a monitor screen. Ligaments, blood vessels, and other types of tissue in action. When his host asked if he wanted to see the ship, he was quick to nod his head in the affirmative. He wanted to know the source of a gently shuddering vibration he felt throughout the ship. Through portals he could see that the ship was moving swiftly upward. What made it go? Could his own people build something like this? They gave him permission to go anywhere on their ship, and suddenly David found his bodily awareness shrunk to a tiny point that could explore anywhere to observe the tiniest details, even between the strangely layered construction. The ship was made with huge metal cones whose broad end descended into the lower rim of the ship. The underlying shape was thus similar to the familiar angel food cake pan on a giant scale. However, these cones were superimposed on top of each other and supported by magnetic fields. David experienced a tornado-like rushing of air. Between the large cones he saw flashes of light that he referred to later as lightning, entering the tornado-like rush of wind. Then he was taken to the outer rim of the spacecraft, where he could see openings that he named breathers. How would he ever describe this process to people on Earth, he wondered. The propulsion system and energy generation were totally novel and unknown to him. He had seen that magnetism was involved. Could he call it magnetic levitation? Wordlessly, impressions apparently from his host entered his mind. He saw the apparatus that made the power source work. Giant cones containing magnets, spheres, and pinions, and a flat cable around 3 polished granite balls. He sensed that it was somehow simple, although so very different from technologies used on Earth that he had no vocabulary to describe what he saw. One principle impressed on his mind was weight into speed, and that once the ship had reached the weightlessness of space, another force would take over as the principal propulsion. Technical details are described in chapters 19 and 22. The space beings told him that artifacts pointing to the knowledge of creating this type of technology could be found on Earth. "We gave it to your people many thousands of years ago. The artifacts, the wonders of past civilizations, are all around your planet, and no one seems to understand. It's up to you to revive these ideas. He was told that Earth people are put in Cladden in danger because that planet is affected by imbalances created on Earth. They said Earth faces a recycling because of human interference with nature and because of the underlying disarray caused by increasingly negative thoughts of a multitude of humans. In contrast, David noted that the advanced code of ethics, harmoniously followed by the three beings, could be a positive example of what humans could choose to become. By following the universal spiritual law of non-interference, the advanced beings can help only if humans ask for their assistance. David's religious upbringing had not prepared him for hearing about a concept such as non-interference. He learned that magnetism was not only part of the ship's propulsion and energy generation, but also included in their healing technology. The beings wanted to teach him more than technology, however. One message was presented to him as if it were a jewel. We are all one, interconnected. We are all composed of the same substance. David wondered if that was why his host said that Earth dwellers could affect beings who live elsewhere in the universe. The messages became specific to Earth's problems, as he was told that the planet will recycle. Planets do that occasionally after so many thousands of years. This will happen to Earth after the second sun becomes your sun and the planet. The space being paused for emphasis. We want to prepare you so that you can build a ship to elevate people away from the planet during that recycling time. Regardless of whether the planet would undergo catastrophic change, they told him then an equally important reason for learning how to build energy machines was to preserve Earth's resources and learn how to respect natural processes. With advanced technology, humankind could also travel to other planets and thus preserve the human species. His hosts repeated the importance of understanding messages left by ancient civilizations. The ship dropped in altitude and flew over a region that he recognized as rocky bushland of Ontario. Then it cruised lower over an area to which he would eventually relocate. His host siphoned water from a creek, not by lowered a hose, but instead by causing movement of water in the creek. A water spout rose and lengthened into a column of water that reached up under the ship. The space beings filtered the water through unique laboratory equipment and showed David the substances in the water that caused trees to die. On, and Archon made it clear that they expected David to build a spaceship before the advent of Earth changes. Me? Build a spaceship? Then what? Many ships would ferry thousands of people into space to another planet, they replied. Don't think the Earth will stay the way it is. Before returning him to his home, the trio promised that within a few months we will be back to visit and speak with your wife, Nora. He was unaware of being back in his physical body in his red chair. Nora and Carol, who had begun to be concerned about the lack of response from the apparently sleeping David, were relieved to see him waken. However, David was disoriented, overwhelmed, and excited. A researcher would later speculate that time must have dilated for David while he was on the ship. Only 15 minutes had passed in his own home, or perhaps thought transference from on and Archon had been unusually rapid. UFO researcher Graham Conway guesses that David's entry into a spaceship was an out-of-body experience, thus explaining why his absence wasn't noticed by Nora and Carol. Also, it is obvious we are not to suppose that the visitors physically materialized from a TV set. Instead, their appearance in front of the screen, which presumably looked snowy to help refocus Hamel's attention, must likewise have been on a level of perception not shared by others. The next day, David quit his carpentry job, then drove to government offices where he applied for his retirement pension. David tells us that a few days later, as he flexed his hand while washing, it felt like he had a splinter. Rubbing a finger over the spot, he felt something. After digging into the irritated area, he found a tiny piece of thin, rigid plastic which, under close examination, he recognized as a piece of microfilm. Upon seeing the microfilm, an acquaintance of David's said he would help develop it for him. Unfortunately, David didn't get the original back and hasn't been able to contact this individual. The copy that was given to David was a photograph of the spaceship he had encountered. He was filled with a firm resolve that has lasted more than 20 years. In addition to caring for a wheelchair-bound wife, he was determined to build a machine like the one he had witnessed, to produce energy without further polluting the planet. He had no idea how many years it would take, nor did he realize that having his mind filled with cosmic knowledge and translating it into a working model were two different matters. Soon he did realize that the first steps would entail building small models of energy devices. It would not be easy. David showed by his actions that he was serious about the job given to him by Archon, and on. He bought materials from the hardware store, used his savings to order a shipment of magnets, dug in the municipal dump for scrap materials, and experimented with magnets. Throughout, he felt that the three people on the ship were putting ideas into his mind and nudging him to do his part. They would guide him from whatever distance as long as he continued to tackle the mandate one step at a time. Filling many pages with drawings and diagrams, he pictured details of the spaceship and tried to understand what made it work. His experiments will be described in Chapter 19. You have to learn about the magnetic and the force, he was told by inner impressions. Learn the balance of the magnetic. As if David's experiences weren't enough strangeness to stir the Hamel household, suddenly little piles of small green leaves began to appear. On the floor, in Nora's bed, or in her hair or tea, or other unexpected places. The Hamels came to believe the leaves are from the angelical plant. Strangely, their fresh texture and green color lasted indefinitely. Nora believed they would have a use in the future, perhaps when David made a ship that might land on other planets. She had no doubt about the reality of his adventure on the ship. She knew her husband well, and he would not invent a story about having been taken from his physical body and into a spaceship. To her, the leaves that appeared over many months were a comfort, reminders that she and her husband were not alone in their struggle. Layers of the 12-pointed leaves appeared in one of Nora's shoes one day before it was placed on her foot. At that moment she received thought pictures that showed her that she would eventually be living in an old house. It was a premonition of their move to Gilmore, Ontario, and helped prepare her for that move. A knock on the door came one day while Nora rested in the daybed next to the window. David opened the door, and the sunlight on his eyes prevented him from immediately recognizing the faces of three people standing before him. An ordinary appearing car was parked in the driveway, and the two men and one woman standing on his porch were dressed in ordinary clothing. When they spoke through telepathy, he realized it was On and Archon. They had come to speak with Nora. In a daze, he led them to her room. He had countless questions to ask, but his eagerness was met with a wordless rebuff. They wanted to talk with Nora without David's intervention. Deflated, he went to the kitchen to make coffee. From a distance, he watched the visitors' backs as they pulled chairs close to Nora's bed. For 3 hours, David sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee and feeling rejected or paced the floor. A miracle was occurring in the other room. Not only could he hear the murmur of low voices and conversation from the visitors, he could also hear Nora's voice. For the first time, she spoke normally, without even a stutter. From snatches of conversation, David gleaned that the visitors were talking about her earlier life and giving advice about her health. They said they had saved her legs from being crushed under a wheel of a large truck that rolled past when, as a 5-year-old, she sat with her legs sticking out. They also said the leaves were a gift to help with her health, and she should curb her generosity and not give them all away. The visitors said their farewells to Nora and David and abruptly left. When David decided to go outside and run after them, it was too late to catch up to the car as it crested the driveway and headed down to the road. He ran to the top of the driveway. Although he could see a long distance down the paved road in both directions, there was no car in sight. Back in the house, Nora had again lost her ability to speak normally. In her former halting sounds, she conveyed to David that the visitors had talked about how humans should be careful about what they do, that they were dealing with Earth's resources in a selfish manner. The trio also said that the time they themselves spend on Earth is lost to them on their planet and, therefore, precious to them. Further, they gave Nora the same information, a time of troubles in the near future, that they'd conveyed to David telepathically on the ship. Many people would be unprepared, they had said to Nora, and would look to the strengths of others who are prepared. The Hamels' acceptance of invisible entities was getting to be too much for their high-strung friend, Carol, who often stayed at the Hamel house. The final incidents drove her away. One evening when David sat alone in the kitchen puzzling over the mystery of the spaceship's unusual technology, without warning the refrigerator door opened and a peanut butter jar floated out. He stared wide-eyed and slack-jawed as it hovered before settling on the table. The lid opened and the peanut butter slowly disappeared. David soon realized that his friends from Cladden were giving him a message, so he composed himself and began an internal dialogue. Let's see, a peanut. A peanut has a hard shell and duality, two inside. He didn't seem to get the message with this first experience. The Hamels didn't eat peanut butter and had bought it for a guest. But David now kept the refrigerator stocked, the jars mysteriously and repeatedly emptied. What was the message? He thought about jars, containers, shells. The thought of shell seemed to light up. Am I supposed to put the ship's engine inside a shell? He wondered. Put an energy-generating system inside some kind of shell. He apparently had deciphered the message. The peanut butter trick ceased. An egg carton was the next player in the series of bizarre events. The carton must have opened by itself, allowing an egg to float out into the room. After hovering, it returned to the carton. David knew the flights of the two objects were meant to tell him something. A shell, he brainstormed. What else? When you cook an egg, the yolk is in the center, so you can cook it until the white is hard and the yolk could still be liquid. What could that have to do with the spaceship? Further reasoning told him that the secret may relate to the shell being thin, or relate to why the yolk doesn't break when the egg is shaken vigorously, unless the shell is broken. That was it. The unbroken membrane between the shell and the white protected the inside of the egg. So the ship must have a type of protective membrane too. Would it be the magnetic field? The day which marked the last straw for Carol was when the three were in the house, each mentally preoccupied with his or her own concerns. Nora was in the living room on the sofa, and Carol, also in the living room, was seated facing the bedroom. Out of the corner of his eye, David noticed something moving in the bedroom. He caught Carol's attention and pointed on the empty bed. A shape like a human body went under the bed cover and wrapped the spread around it. It only became a visible shape as it went under the covers. Then it disappeared, and the covers settled down onto the bed. One sunny day after Carol's departure, Nora was in the bedroom with the new housekeeper, and David was standing in the living room. He had a vision of an enormous bee, about 3 feet long, hovering above the carpet. David knew this was not a physical reality, such as the peanut butter jars and the egg had been, nor was it the seemingly poltergeist category, as was the moving bedspread. Nevertheless, it was a visible entity that he could walk around while watching the fast vibration of its wings and observe its 30-inch-long proboscis penetrating a flower and sucking its nectar. The trunk-like tubular proboscis moved in 3 sections in separate rotational movements. Even the bee's leg movements seemed to communicate something. On its back, lines of contrasting colors of its hair moved as the bee shifted its body, echoing the way that the 3 lines of the proboscis moved. Then a snake curled around the bee. Black bars marked the snake's back, and the creature was almost triangular in shape, with its tail near its mouth as it coiled once around the bee. Further, a small piglet was being swallowed through the serpent's mouth. The undulations of the snake while swallowing caused its rings of dark coloring to move in a motion similar to the 3-part proboscis. Bars of color on one part of the bee, serpent, piglet vision would open on one side and close on the other, as rings along the snake worked in conjunction with its mouth to create suction and rhythmic contortions. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Vibrating leg movements of the bee also tapped out the rhythm and worked together with its body's opposing movements. Am I dreaming? David wondered. However, he knew the scene had appeared to teach him something. The vision was making a sound much like kryptonic. David had read about something. The vision was making a sound. David had read about Superman's adventures with Krypton and thought it odd that he was hearing that sound. The new housekeeper heard him repeating it aloud, but when she came into the room, she saw him circling around empty air and trying to make sense of what he was being taught about focus, making a vibrating noise, taking a breath. He realized that in rushing air is also vital to the systems of the flying ship. And then there was the broken line of the proboscis. Later David would see a principle of how the ship's propulsion system worked. He would refer to the 3-part movement of lines vertically, to be described later in this book, as an isotope line, although his meaning of the word isotope is entirely different from the accepted physics meaning of the word. This was his final apparition, clarifying his picture of the movement of the huge cones in the spacecraft. He was still a long way from being able to recreate the immense force built up in those cones in order to accomplish the task set upon his shoulders by the 3 space people. The ships required to carry thousands of people off the Earth would operate in a manner so different from Earth's current technology that there was no one to teach David how to build it. Instead, he would be ridiculed for many years as he learned through trial and error. His private terminology would include butterfly, his description of the fluttering, continuous falling forward motion that needs no resetting. His first demonstrations consisted simply of a tumbling metal ball with a magnet on it, kept in circular motion on a surface by the wobbling of a large handheld magnet above it. Again, the experiments described in the Granite Man and the butterfly will be dealt with later in this book. A coffee shop waitress in whom David had confided telephoned the local Gazette newspaper. Soon a headline read, "Introducing David Hamel. He rides in flying saucers." The reporter, Glenn Kask, wrote that David knew the secret of perpetual motion and was building a device to allow people to heat homes, power industries, and fly aircraft with technology developed more than 3 billion miles from Earth. Hamel is convinced of the reality of his experience, and local mental health authorities have no records which cast doubt on his sanity. Although the reporter erroneously described the spacecraft's propulsion system as steam-propelled, most of the article was accurate. It noted that David had an impressive collection of correspondence from learning institutions. So far, the federal government has declined participation in the project. The article brought a man into David's life who introduced himself as an ex-priest and who took the microfilm that David had dug out of his own hand and returned with an enlargement of the picture. The stranger then disappeared with the piece of microfilm. Seeing the photograph of the spacecraft reinforced David's conviction that his out-of-body experience had not been a dream. And although his extraterrestrial visitors did not return, they seemed to prod him mentally. Balance, it's all about balance, was the message as he experimented with magnetic force. Finally, he felt ready to build a small model of the power generator he'd seen. Many of his materials came from junkyards, such as bicycle rims to serve as bases for handmade aluminum cones and to hold magnets that he had taped on with electric tape. Working in a garage attached to his house, he placed the apparatus inside a 45-gallon steel barrel ringed on the outside with magnets. When the components lined up, he screwed down the cover on the barrel, which compressed the apparatus and began the continual tumbling motion. After the wobbling, circling motion reached a certain speed, the vibration stabilized. David went into the house to share his success and to attend to Nora's needs. If the motion of the apparatus continued until the next morning, he thought, he would be very surprised. It'll never fly, but maybe I can learn from it, he told Nora. Approximately 12 minutes after setting the device in motion, there was a very loud bang. A red glow came from the direction of the garage. "Fire!" Nora yelled. The scene encountered inside the garage was dismaying. His device had exploded out of the steel drum and was scattered all over the room. Apparently the red glow had been from a buildup of energy of some type as the device had been operating. There was no fire, but his investment in ceramic magnets was destroyed. Broken roofing shakes on the garage and the mass of metal was also discouraging, but David saw that he could indeed build something that demonstrated the power of the principles involved. In the summer of 1977, David experimented with a second model, this time built on a two-wheeled trailer. When set in motion, it created unusual energy effects, such as affecting photographic film and ruining the reception of nearby television sets. Meanwhile, he also worked on a larger model, using a magnetic principle instead of a falling ball to keep it in motion. The new model would be tested outdoors in order to save the shed ceiling from another accident. The next summer he built a 10-foot raised plywood platform in front of his house, on the edge of his already crowded property in Maple Ridge, British Columbia. The high platform not only hid his work from the view of a nosy neighbor, it also isolated the model electrically for David's safety. Neighbors laughed, called him Frenchy, and joked about his tower and the contraption on it. David ignored them. He was certain that the energy technology he'd been shown could eliminate energy wars and allow people to live in harmony. What importance was an untidy yard in comparison? Working at night, he hoisted pieces of the machine from the garage up a 16-foot ladder and onto the platform. When completed, the model was more than 7 feet in diameter at the bottom and between 3 and 4 feet high. He had already spent several $1,000s on materials. At 11 o'clock one night, Nora was inside the house and David was out working on the machine. It was time to put on the cap, a garbage can lid with a magnet attached. By the time he finished screwing it down, he felt a glow from the metal. It was changing color underneath where his abdomen touched it. He jumped back quickly and slid down the ladder. On the ground, he pulled back the ladder so that no one could climb it and be injured. A rushing of wind around or in the machine on the platform told him that it was seriously in motion. David ran into the house, where Nora told him that the television set had gone dead. "Never mind the TV, where's the camera?" David snapped. Suddenly a power failure plunged the neighborhood into darkness. He groped for the camera where he had placed it near the television. As he rushed out the door, he clicked and advanced the camera film manually a dozen times, pointing the lens toward his machine. The blue-gray glow became greenish. The machine had become a flying craft, heading westward as it rose. It glowed increasingly bright, and the light surrounding the craft became yellow and finally bright red. When his machine disappeared from his view, David ran back into the house and telephoned the airports in Maple Ridge and Abbotsford, asking if their radar could see an unidentified flying object. The people on duty could not see the machine within their radar corridor. $3,000 worth of magnets flying off into the sky. David stomped around in frustration. All the time it took to build the thing. Several weeks after the night the neighborhood lost electricity and David lost his working model, Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers came to his house and searched inside and outside. Finally one of the officers called out, "There's nothing here." "There's nothing here, all right," David muttered. "I just lost the damn thing." When the film from his camera was developed, the results supported the theory that strange energy fields or radiation are created by flying saucers. The first shots were exposed as a bright light over the whole film. Others looked like a double exposure, but a half-dozen shots turned out, showing the receding glow. David regained his philosophical attitude about the difficulties of learning a new technology. You have to learn to crawl before you can walk. He continued to build models, working up to 18 hours a day in the summertime. Over the years, he wrote to numerous universities and officials in an attempt to get help with the project. Perhaps not all the letters were filed in the crank file, the wastebaskets, because he did get an unannounced visit from a car full of men who barged into the house flashing badges, identifying themselves as employees of the Boeing Aircraft Company near Seattle. One of the men used his telephone, and David heard him say, "He doesn't have anything." They left as rudely as they had arrived. "Wait until I get my 5-ton machine built," David said to the retreating automobile. His next plan was to build an experimental prototype whose body was made of concrete so that it would not fly away. He hoped it would demonstrate the conversion of energy. In the following years he experimented doggedly while dealing with challenges. Being surrogate parent to 2 native boys, caring for Nora, and moving to Ontario. These adventures are told in The Granite Man and The Butterfly. David continued to build larger models, despite a shortage of money and a surplus of visitors. No quitter, he is determined to meet his goal. On, and Archon's expectation that he will build an Arc-sized spacecraft. Chapter 19. The Work of David Hamel, Robert Thompson. David Hamel's various experiments all follow a consistent pattern. The devices are configured to create a mechanical creation model, designed from Genesis. The power source is a star obtained by tapping into the neutral point from higher dimensions. His work attempts to recreate the basic principles of the propulsion system he observed on the spaceship. He claims properly designed systems that can utilize 3 or 4 of the primary elements or fundamental forces can tap into this energy. The earth or gravity component is obtained by the principle called weight into speed. This involves a continually rotating granite sphere which creates an unequal loading to the system below it. This is designed to remain in balance. The sphere never finds its true center point, so is in continual movement. This relates to the design of the seed of life, whose system is self-balancing, but is subjected to unequalizing frequencies from the star. This causes the seed to vibrate in sympathy with the star for its growth. The sphere is rotating in a constrained manner inside an inverted cone, on a granite platform called a butterfly. The butterfly could be rounded or flat and is continually oscillating in a circular motion due to the rotating sphere. It has the appearance of a butterfly in flight. The vibration of the seed forming from the isotope line creates air from the etheric or the zero-point energies. A comparison would be the formation of air bubbles at the bottom of a boiling pot of water. The isotope line forces the air to flow in a vortex under tremendous pressure. This pressure creates friction, causing an increase in air temperature and expansion of the air. The water or magnetic component is obtained by the interaction of two magnets and attraction. The electric or spark point is at the neutral location, one halfway between the positive and negative poles of the magnet. These four powers are in a constant state of motion, attempting to remain in balance. David discovered ways to tap into these natural processes. In this chapter, 3 experiments David conducted between 1976 and 1980 will be described in detail. These are representative of the variations possible in utilizing the 4 fundamental powers. David had to figure out on his own how to tap this power with guidance from A, On, and Archon. If someone felt there was some truth to what he was saying and that it was important enough for them to understand, it has been David's practice to explain a portion of the principles to that person. This individual would need to do as much as possible on their own. It is for this reason David had not kept detailed records of his accomplishments. It has been confusing and frustrating for myself at certain times to obtain all the details in order to duplicate his experiments. This was until I realized some of my questions needed to be answered from within myself. My failures would lead me to the right answers. Weight into speed. Robert Thompson. David constructed a concrete model based on the principle of weight into speed. The top of the device was shaped like a pyramid. He got this idea from his 3 alien friends who told him to study ancient artifacts to understand the technology. The drawing shown is similar to the model he built. His device didn't include a way to adjust the height of the top outside shell. About 75 people observed the demonstration of this model. As it started to operate, the observers could sense a vibration through the ground and thought it might be an earthquake. Some became frightened and stood up to get away. Then it stopped after several seconds with a clunk. People were disappointed nothing else occurred. David used a bowling ball for the sphere at the top, and the 2 butterflies and vibrating base were made out of steel. The exterior shell consisted of reinforced concrete. The top portion of the exterior shell can be raised or lowered by the height adjustment bolts. This will affect the radius of rotation of the sphere inside an inverted cone and the wobbling circular motion of the 2 butterflies. The sphere and the 2 butterflies are each one part of the isotope line, necessary for the device to work, according to David. As the sphere rotates along a constrained path, it will rise and fall slightly due to the oscillating isotope line. In this device, the sphere takes the place of the top cone in the 2 Tree of Life experiments. The sphere in the act of falling to one side from the gravity component also replaces the 2 donut-shaped magnets at the top, tending to offset the cones. Without the capacitor, the powers used by the device are the earth or gravity component, air, and fire. The earth power is provided by the sphere. The air is created by the isotope line. The air flowing in a vortex generates friction, creating the spark. With the capacitor, the water or magnetic element is also involved. The spark is obtained in an additional method now, at the neutral point between the magnets. Shortly after this experiment, he and Nora moved to Ontario and took the model with them. David didn't attempt to modify the device to get it to work properly because of design problems and lack of funds. The top of the exterior shell was not adjustable, the system was not properly balanced, and the interior components should have been made out of granite. Granite is harder than steel. David is now in the process of building the weight into speed device. Page 348, Robert Thomas. David was told by his alien friends that everything needed for life and good health can be provided on the ship. The atmosphere is continually cleansed of dangerous gases. Pure fresh air is drawn from the breathers, light is obtained from glass windows in the breathers, fresh water is acquired from condensation from the interior granite walls and is collected at the base. The third stage contains a garden. All disease is eliminated and the aging process is halted. The last statement coincides with the last sentence in Genesis 3:22. And now lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. The ship is a toroid and creates its own universe. Its four primary element circuits coincide with that of the rodent toroid. The ship creates its own gravity, but is not subjected to the forces of gravity from outside its field or to the force of inertia during acceleration. Both the wings and bellows force the air to flow in a white hole expanding vortex phase. The return path to the breathers is the suction black hole cycle. As the air spirals in a clockwise direction, there are certain openings along its path where less resistance is encountered with increased flow. The placement of these openings encourages the air to flow in a vortex. The first openings are above and below the sphere cups. The other points along the circle contain magnets which tend to push the air back toward the breather. The second openings are between the two wings of the first stage pinions. At this position, the air can also easily flow through a gap between the lower and upper wing bellows at the vent locations. The remaining openings along the expanding spiral are for the same reasons noted above. I asked David, in outer space the wings don't have air to push against. How does it work there? He stated, it changes the structure of the vacuum. It can push against the vacuum of space. The ship operates the same way in our atmosphere as it does in outer space or underwater. The ship also creates its own magnetic field in accordance with the toroidal model. The electric component is in the form of a series of capacitively coupled parallel plates, each wing together with the corresponding transformer rod with bellows in all three stages are of opposite charge of the second. This area includes the expanding white hole phase in the northern hemisphere of the toroid. The charged air is then redirected back to the center of the toroid during the suction black hole cycle in the southern hemisphere. The known physics of actions occurring within the ship are explained with magnetohydrodynamics.